Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Modern Golden Age podcast. And today with me I have the one and only Eyal Shay. Eyal, thank you so much for coming for on the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, João.
Now it's my pleasure, and I wanted to start talking about we'll talk about your podcast and about dialectics and about a bunch of other things. But as I was doing some research for our conversation, I stumbled upon your website, and in the about page, you have there a quote where you say, "From most relevant to least, I am a father and husband," and then you go and say a podcaster, and then and in the end, it's like a gardener, and I was really moved by this. Why is it that you consider that the most important thing that you are is a father and a husband?
Well, I mean, it just takes precedence before everything. It's all nice that we go online, that we're so busy doing our projects, whatever. But first and foremost, I'm part of a household with my wife and my child, and I depend on them the most, and they depend on me the most. So that's kind of where naturally my commitment and energy goes to first and foremost. It's really there's no decision that doesn't go through the filter of is it good for all of us as a
Yeah.
little society.
Yeah, that was when the first time we connect, we actually did it because to discuss relationships. Basically, I had a bunch of questions to ask you in that sense, and like what I remember that leaving that with our conversation with this idea of always making sure that the choices you make are aligned with your family and with your relationship. That it makes a lot of sense. You're also a tour guide in Israel, right? And that's something like I'm since because my background is music and then I went to corporate trainer and now I'm an entrepreneur in education, like I'm always looking for people that have these seemingly totally different backgrounds. Tell us a little bit about how you end up being a tour guide in Israel and what you love about it.
Yeah. So first of all, I think like the chain of really quite seemingly unrelated things maybe starts with maybe the fact that I was at all in the army, but we have to do that. So that wouldn't have been my choice, but we have to do that. So that's unlikely for me as a person. Then getting out of the army, moving to the US for 2.5 years, mostly living in an off the grid homestead in the forest, coming back, wanting to go to university, getting a degree in English literature and linguistics. So that's why, I don't know. Finishing that, not really knowing what to do with that professionally, then looking at my dad who made the switch from factory manager to tour guide around his 50th birthday, realizing that I don't have to wait until I'm 50, doing the course for that, which is quite um, serious. It takes 2 years, and you
Wow.
have to have a lot of knowledge about a lot of different things and aspects of Israel, history, archaeology, botany, geology,
Oh, wow.
archaeology, religion, so a lot. And then just starting to work with that, not even knowing that it would be a job that I like, but I really like it, and I like meeting the people. And meeting the people is really what connects every experience that I've had and probably will have.
Yeah, that's so interesting because when we actually discussed this early about how you ended up being a tour guide, but when we talked about it, I always thought like my mental picture of being a tour guide was like being a tour guide on Lisbon, which has nothing to do with what you just described. Like it's way easier. I had no idea. Like out of curiosity, guide me through the process. Like, what would a normal day as a tour guide would look like? Like, would you go to different places? How would that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it is strange. I'm a tour guide for the whole country, which is I think a quarter of the size of Portugal, about,
Yeah.
but it's still a large area.
A
And
lot.
I'm supposed to know everything about all the cities in it, about all the archaeological sites, about all the religious sites, of which there are a lot. Um, so, of course, there are like the usual suspects in terms of places to visit with tourists, like Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, the Dead Sea, Caesarea are the four main places to go to. But yeah, it can be quite surprising, and I work with people trying to see what they're interested in. Touring with somebody who's here for the first time and is a Catholic Christian is just very different from touring with a Jewish person from New York who's been here a dozen times, and then the challenge is to find a place which they haven't seen yet. It's not really a challenge. There are a lot, but yeah, it can take me all over the place, and yeah, so it's very diverse. The kind
Yeah.
of there is no typical thing.
Yeah, it's so great that you actually adjust like what you guys are doing based on the person or the persons that are visiting. So I have to ask, like, let's say that I've never gone to Israel. Let's say that I have like a spare weekend and I decide to go. Like, what are some of the places that I must watch or see actually, and especially what are some of the places where I have to eat because I'm a food lover. So, what are the best restaurants that I definitely need to check out?
Yeah, so if you're a food lover and you're not too much of a religious person, because it's kind of this there's this crazy dichotomy. There's Jerusalem, this really old, approximately 5,000-year-old city, right? That is holy to the major Abrahamic religions. And it's still the energies there, like the religious stuff on Saturdays, it's completely closed up. There are no shops and stuff because people are keeping the Sabbath. And then there's Tel Aviv, which is this European cosmopolitan, often called the gay capital of Europe, on all its food and theaters and all that, and they're just an hour away, you know. So
Mm,
that's Israel for you. Everything is condensed. So now that you've
yeah.
told me that you're a foodie and looking to see that, then it would definitely be Tel Aviv. And yeah, there are just so many good restaurants. There's a beach, and it doesn't lack in history as
Yeah.
well. Architecture, there's a UNESCO World Heritage Site that's part of Tel Aviv with a special architecture style
Mm.
that's in there. But for weekend, for you, that would be Tel Aviv. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I might do it, and then I'll let you know. So, moving on, you have this phenomenal podcast, which I really love. It's called Deep Dive Podcast. And I remember that the first time that I actually heard one of your episodes was with Paul, the improv teacher, and it was
Hmm.
phenomenal. And I really loved the concept. And I've doing research for this podcast. I've listened to a bunch of other episodes that I found interesting or that I thought that I would find interesting, and then ended up actually loving it even more. But my question is, like, first of all, can you, for people that haven't heard your podcast, can you please let us know what you talk about and how did that came through?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the kind words first of all, and I'm really glad you like it. Yeah, the podcast is basically one of my main interests is philosophy, which we're going to touch on later. And I wanted to bring that into the public sphere and talk about it, but not really stay clear of anything that's philosophy in academia, which is just this like as we call it, doxography. It's just like who said what at what year, and then he commented, and it's just this like people kind of building castles in the air in terms of these like super abstract ideas. So by the time it gets to like modern and postmodern French philosopher, it's like all gobbledygook. It's really hard to understand. And philosophy, people have to understand is the activity of pursuing a good life. So understanding what it is and doing what it takes. This is philosophy to me. And so I wanted to talk with people and start understanding. from each guest what is one idea, because it could be many ideas, and some of them come back for a second conversation, but just one idea can get a whole show very easily. One idea that has helped people live well, however they define it. I have my definition for living well, and it's just fascinating to kind of go straight at the beliefs, conceptions that people have, and that help them get through this messy thing called life.
Yeah.
And I just find it fascinating and infinitely interesting. Yeah, so that's kind of how it came to be.
Yeah, and it's a great show, and people that are listening should definitely subscribe. And one of the things that I really enjoy is that, like you just said, like philosophy is something practical. You should use it to pursue the good life, right? And one of the things that I really like about your podcast is that like you can listen to all these different podcasts about around optimization and hacks and tricks and all that stuff, and it's usually way easier to digest, right? It's basically, here are three things that you need to do in order to live a better life. Do this, do this, do this, and that's easy. The thing is, in my experience, it doesn't bring transformation. You change for a bit, and then you get back and you listen to another show and another show and another show. And one of the things that I really enjoy about Deep Dive is that, because of that passion around philosophy, you actually talk with your guests in a more deep way, and that allows you to, maybe I don't leave a deep dive podcast with 7 hacks to do X, but I may have like this great idea that can have a deep impact in my life. So my question would be, like, why do you think that people prefer the hacks? And the second question is, like, do you agree with my assessment of the kind of conversations that you have?
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Well, what you're describing, I think, is spoon feeding, which people love. So I think the reason behind people really flocking to buy the book with the 10 rules, or buy the course with the 10 steps, or what, it's just something that's natural to us, and there's nothing wrong with it. We as people are just tend to go for whatever is immediate, so immediate gratification. When information is just given to us instead of us having to think about, that's like conceptually um, very enticing. But as you say, that doesn't drive a meaningful change, because actually the best way to really gain knowledge of something is to go through the steps and understand what are some of the wrong, where some of the wrong turns are going to get you, right? So it's not just about taking the path of least resistance, like you get when you put on like a navigation app like Waze or Google. Um, People are worse at navigation now that we have these apps, right? Because you actually want to know what turn you should get, and also what you would see if you didn't turn that way. Um, Yeah, so I think the right way for listening to my podcast is even just looking at the whole thing as a concept album, and that gets hard with dozens of episodes. But a concept album is not something that you judge by one song. You see how the whole fits. And
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite things is to see how different conversations, and then they together bring to me new ideas that I can work out on my own later. But hearing Paul, for example, and then hearing my friend Nico on another episode, and it's like from the synthesis, I get an even fresher idea. So that's what I suggest people do. And yeah, so basically, to answer your question, I think we're just creatures who are born to kind of stick to the immediate thing and see
Mm-hmm.
what's right in front of us and is accessible here. Whereas thinking about the good life as a process, and this is why I say living well, not the good life. The good life is something static, which presumably you can possess, right? You can reach out and grab it, and you have it, while living well is a process. And we just tend to make things static and treat them as unchanging objects instead of processes, which is what life is a process.
Yeah, that makes a little sense. So, how did you went from like, because what you're saying makes total sense. We're human beings. We're it's in our almost like in our DNA to just look at the last thing, the easy thing, the spoon feeding, as you were mentioning. But your podcast is basically the opposite of that. And my question is, how did you become a person that actually pursues the opposite of that instead of just accepting the spoon feeding?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great segue into dialectic. Dialectic, and I just released an episode on my podcast with my mentor and friend Ivor, who introduced me to the concept and to the art of dialectic. But basically, dialectic is the art of constructing a true model of the world, and we do that by empowering people to think for themselves and to think critically, to think dialectically. So that means doing a lot of comparison and contrast between concepts and using logic, kind of making sure that the mental model that we have is not full of knots or is mangled up or is something which it's just a natural way for it to be built. If things are just learned haphazardly, there are contradictions in our thinking. So we want to get rid of that. And once we do, we have a clearer picture of everything. And we're also, by understanding the nature of the good, start to think about what is a worthy object of pursuit for us in this life. And then it's like, okay, we're here for a reason none other than living well. And then you start thinking about what that means. And naturally and logically, it follows that it's not a static thing. And it could never come about because of the stuff you have. It's about how you, as a process yourself, is in interaction with nature. And by nature, I mean everything. Um, the whole universe, including other people, everything that's not our psyche. Yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I found fascinating in dialectics, let's just jump in, is you mentioned another podcast where you were actually a guest. I think that you said something along the lines of by exploring the constraint, not the constraints, the how do you say, the borderlands, not borderlands, but you'll get the point. By
Yeah.
exploring the borderlands of a concept, that's when we fully know that concept, right? I really like that idea of using dialectics to know something uh, totally. Let's call it like, because if I know the boundaries, right, I'll know I have to recognize everything that's within those boundaries, within those constraints, right? So that's a way to actually, in an age where we just talk so much about critical thinking, uh, I was actually embarrassed to never heard of dialectics before. And so I have, before we get into specifically how can we practice dialectics, why do you think that there aren't that many people familiarized with dialectics? Or maybe there is, and I'm just living on a bubble. And if that's the case, that's fine. But why do you think that that's so few people know about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, don't be embarrassed. People don't know about it. Some people in academia have heard about Hegelian dialectic. That's completely different than what um, I do, than what Ivor does. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it starts with the fact that Ivor kind of discovered dialectic and really recognized it to be the main overarching theme of Plato's dialogues because he dealt with Plato. And Plato's dialogues are often really the mainstream way of analyzing them is completely confused and misguided, so people don't land on that um, dialectic. And yeah, it's a very niche thing, and so it's not at all your fault. But I also, I don't think that nobody knows about it, but I think nobody really practices it as the art that it is. And Plato just laid the blueprint for us to follow for what dialectic is. But for that, we need to recognize his dialogues for what they are, puzzles. And puzzles, that really touches on the idea of, seeing, understanding something better or having knowledge of something better when it's the negative space that's left, when all limits or borders are explored. So you can literally think of a jigsaw puzzle. So now the life hacks type of approach that we discussed, that's almost like you're a kid and you're being presented with a beautiful picture. And it's like, here's the picture, right? This is it, right? And you actually wouldn't know how to put a picture together. And dialectic
Mm-hmm.
is really the art of learning how to put a picture together,
Mm-hmm.
and a beautiful picture at that, and a
Mm-hmm.
true picture at that. And a jigsaw puzzle, so that is something which we all know gets easier as the more pieces are in there, right? So you start from the corners, presumably, and the edges, because that's easy. You see something there. And you just progress, and you always try to find a piece that's adjacent to something you already know is in
Mm-hmm.
its right place. And sometimes you move things around, so it's a gradual process that's kind of about the whole. Um, yeah, so I think that's a good metaphor to explain why puzzles work so much better than simple didactic dogma when it
Yeah.
comes to understanding things.
Yeah, it makes in fact not only not only a kid wouldn't be able to come up with that image, but it also won't question it, right? It will see it as this final product that it may not even be true or even or beautiful, but it's just presented to him as this is what it is. And it may not. So you just mentioned that Plato gives us a blueprint to actually practice dialectics. As someone who never read the Plato's work except probably the Republic a few years ago, what's that blueprint? Like, how can we practice that art?
Yeah, so a big question there, and I would simply have to just to save some time, like refer you to the episode I just did with Ivor, and also there's a link through my Twitter profile to my alternative Twitter profile of Dialectician, and over there you can find a link to a short document that I wrote about dialectic. So it can be found there. But in short, what Plato did is wrote dialogues, and they are not tragedies, they are not comedies, they are not poetry, they are not just nice stories, but they're also not philosophical treatises, because otherwise people wouldn't be confused about it. They're dialectical puzzles. And because they're strange, they're supposed to pique your curiosity. So you're supposed to go, huh, that's interesting, which most scholars don't. So, for example, Socrates says something early in the dialogue and then later on says something, oh, do you remember that we agreed on these things? And his interlocutor will usually say yes. But it's actually not true. If you remember and you go back, it's like they did not agree to that at all.
Mm,
You're supposed to go high. You're supposed to be a good scientist. You're supposed to be looking at these indiscrepancies, realize that the words spoken are not what the dialogue is about. Turn your attention to the characters. Realize that they're models. Realize that these models represent paradigms of a concept. And finally, after piecing everything together and have a strong thesis or hypothesis where everything finally makes sense to you in the dialogue, you get a good picture of what Plato's thoughts on one concept is. But the point is not even to give you the right idea about this concept. The point is um, to give you the benefit of having learned how to solve a puzzle, and you
the
do that
process.
dialectically. So
Yeah.
you do that with the next dialogue and so on. And by the end of that, you become a dialectician and a person who's thinking well, So that aspect of life of thinking about concepts, it just
Hmm.
helps you go through the noise of life and cut through to the things that are important because there's endless stimuli
Hmm.
out there. And if you're triggered by all of them or you go and pay attention to everything, that's unsustainable. So you
Yeah.
want to think about the relatively few things that are very important to you. And these are things like love, justice, living well, what is good, fitting, and a few other things.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And we'll leave the descriptions, actually we'll leave the links in the description for the episodes of everything that you just mentioned. But one of the reasons that I found fascinating this whole approach to thinking is because in order for us to get into a modern golden age, I do believe that part of it is just to improve our thinking, to make sure that we're able to look at life from a different standpoint that then allows us to do the things in order to get into the modern golden age. And so, making that shift there, what is a modern golden age to you?
Yeah, I mean that's such a good insight you shared right there. To me, I think a relevant quote here is by Henry Miller, who said, "Everything that has to be maintained by force is doomed." Right? And this
Mm,
includes every system that we experience so far in civilization was like a pressure cooker with some strong figure, dictator, ancestor, whatever, kind of holding everything together. And it's there's apparent order in that. Okay, it's sort of orderly, um, but it's unstable, and it's going to just collapse at some
crumble.
point, which
Yeah.
has happened and will happen to empires. And give it enough time, and it literally doesn't matter what country you're looking at. The U.S., China, they're all going at some point. Okay, no matter how long it's going to take. Um, so yeah, it's very much related to dialectic because when I say people are thinking well and thinking for themselves, you don't need that. You don't need the ordering principle that's some strong man who is telling everybody what to think. You don't need laws, right? If you have people who understand what justice is, well, they will understand for one that justice isn't the law and couldn't be following the law. Because you
Mm-hmm.
and I right now could think of instances where following the law is the unjust thing to do, or where breaking the law is the just thing to do, right?
Yeah.
And sadly, we live in a society where this is not really, it's not something that we think about, but this is going to change if everybody, and yes, is it completely utopian at this point? Of course, I don't have any kind of um, thought that I'm going to live to see it. But if you distribute, if every other person is ordered in their own psyche and body, an agent of order, then it could be a grassroots movement of creating an orderly society. And order is kind of a hallmark of logic. And with everything fitting in well together, that's going to be much, much more stable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think our society so far have been, you could say granite, you could say maybe even the toughest rock we know on Earth, right? But still, it's naturally formed. There are going to be cracks and stuff like that. Whereas some forms of crystals that are extremely tough, like diamond, that's a difference there, because of the arrangement of things. So
Mm-hmm.
that would be a modern golden age for me, is when enough people are internally in good condition so that they can give rise to a society that's in good condition and good health. And this is going to create stability, elegance, sustainability, and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, that's such a great answer. And so my question would be relating both dialectics and the modern golden age. Like By thinking critically, I may arrive at a notion of what, say, living in community is. Because I let's say that that's a topic that's very important to me because I want to bring the modern golden age. I want to be part of those individuals that are good with themselves so they can create this new kind of society. And I arrive at the conclusion of what living with others is. But let's say that you just do the same thing, and through dialectics you arrive at a different conclusion. So how can we then make sure that even though we have different views, this does not get in the way of building something different? Because if we don't find a solution to that, we may end up just rebuilding something once again that is sustained by force, and because of that, prepared for collapse. So how do we harmonize different views?
Yeah, that's a really good question. People are amazingly diverse. We have very different preferences about what we like to eat, who we like to spend time with, what kind of hobby we engage in. But it's actually maybe, and it may sound paradoxical to people, even though it's not. It's actually the high level stuff that's easiest to agree on, right? Because
Mm,
we have to do dialectic with other people um, in order to know what we're talking about when we're talking about a thing. Because if we haven't done that, and you and I are going to talk about justice, for example, I'm going to simply assume that you have the same conception of justice as I am. That's just not true. We're going
yeah.
to do that. So dialectic is all about uh, going on a shared search for the truth. Okay, and even though I'm a dialectician and you may be a dialectician, we want to learn from one another. We want to agree, and luckily for us, there is logic in just it's a thing that's there. Um, so we are going to end up on the same page, and it's the high level stuff, the stuff that we can immediately agree on, that is kind of good for us, beneficial for us. Love, for example, that's actually going to make it very unlikely that we're going to end up with different views of
Mm,
what love is if we go step by step. And if we
mm,
don't agree on something, then let's find the last point where we did agree, and
mm,
um, and so on, and it might take a while, and maybe for a while we won't really understand one another. So it might take a while for us to really stumble on an adjacent concept which we haven't understood and tend to that, something like desire.
yeah.
Maybe for you, um, yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but and once we fix that thing with desire, we now see that love is much easier to sort out. But the nature of thing is such that some things are just not going to be so different as to make us um, put us in opposite corners of the boxing
Mm,
ring. If
yeah.
you're gonna tell me like, oh, love is not even a good thing, that we should aspire, well, okay, but you find many
Yeah.
people like
Yeah, that would be hard though. To find people interested in building a modern golden age that would actually consider that love is a negative thing. But like, I usually ask this question, which is basically, what are some values that you believe that are related to the modern golden age? But I wanted to just shift a little bit this question to you specifically, because since we talked about dialectics, and what happens is, instead of what are some of the values in the modern golden age, I would love to ask you, what are some of the concepts you think we need to think about in order to get to a modern golden age?
the good. Start from there. Um, really, it works on all of these things that I mentioned, and there are a lot of things that are related. And really, I have to say they're pretty much all in Plato's writing, so it's not like we still have to do the work. Like, I'm familiar with correct analyses for 5 or 6 dialogues, one of which I've done and the other are by Ivor. But There are 36 dialogues, and we need more people to work on that. And it's not because we're going to adopt Plato's opinion as it is and betray ourselves and not think about critically. But I have to say, the man was uncannily kind of giving good good accounts of concepts in his puzzles. So it's a lot of puzzles, but start with the good, and this is what we're also doing on the first. This is the concept that we're trying to figure out first when I'm doing dialectic with people. The good is just extremely important for a few reasons.
And so, can you name a few? Is it
Yeah, absolutely. Well, um, since it's given that we're alive, then the next thing is kind of to ask, well, what kind of life do you want, right? And the answer is, well, I want a good life. So I want to live well. So it's right there. It's the very first thing that kind of gets bunched together with, what could be a good thing for us to pursue in this life. And this is above. I could pursue a pious life. I could pursue a life of luxury. I could pursue a life of love or something like. But none of these things are inherently telling me that I'm living a good life.
a good life?
So you want to go straight to the source and find out what the good is. Um, so that is going to explain to you what the adverb is of well in living well, and also it just clarifies our thinking immediately once we realize good is a relation, um, and it helps us really. It's at the base of looking forward at having a foresight. Basically,
What?
having sound foresight hinges on our understanding of the good.
Yeah. So, two questions. First of all, when you say
Mhm.
that good is a relationship, you mean that as in a way that a certain action will be more aligned with the good than the other? Is that what it is, or is it anything else?
Um, Not exactly. I mean, and I hesitate here because I don't want to spoon feed anybody, and people listening will understand that I'm doing it for their own good. But
Yeah.
if you were to tell me we could start with a few questions, then I would do it to you. So, yeah, what do you think?
Hmm. So and suddenly we turn this into a session, right? Okay. But yeah. So me trying to define the good. I would say that the good um is something that makes me feel aligned. Something that I don't have any how do you say like I'm not hesitant in having done it, having done something. So let's say that I do something, and then later when I'm thinking about that, I'm completely uh calm with having done that action. uh that's what I would say is the good, I think.
Is
uh
that, do you mean that you feel that regardless of outcomes, maybe the outcomes weren't the ones you really hoped for?
yeah, I'm yeah, I'm willing to say that the outcomes aren't the ones that I was expecting, but that to me is less important than making sure that the action was the action that I wanted to take.
Hmm.
uh
Yeah. So, yeah, we're not gonna do a session here. Don't worry, because yeah, this takes its time. But the beginning of dialectic is taking something like the good and exactly going like that, understanding. For me, it's going to be understanding the getting to know the mind of Joam and see what interests you, what connotations it brings into your mind when I say the good. Um, and then maybe look at a few very common uses that we have for the word good, and maybe not start with the things that are very convoluted and complicated about inner conflicts and finding romantic partners and all that. But no, with everyday things where it might be easier because we're less emotionally triggered. So, like, what is a good
mm,
knife, for example? What is a
mm,
good chair? And start kind of trying to get a 360-degree view of things that are around the good, because this is what we want to do, right? Is
yeah.
find the limits of that and look at that. But I will say that, it quite early on, it turns out that the good is a relation. Like, I will say that because, and I can give an easier example of relations, right? Relations which we know, it's something like insight. If I asked you what is insight, what is the concept of insight?
Of insight or
Mhm.
inside? Sorry.
Inside, something that's inside something, or near, or far away from. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. th- I guess it would be something that's I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know how
so
to
so
describe
at,
it.
at, at certain times in your life, you're going to say something like, "Oh, the remote is in the box," right?
Mm,
So the remote is inside. Does it mean that
inside.
the remote control for the TV is inherently inside something, or is it going to be outside in a minute?
It can be on the
So
outside.
it's not inherently inside, right? Which
Yeah.
really gives us this moment to think about. Oh, it's inside is a relation. It's not something which is attributed to something, and that's it. The thing
Mm.
um,
Oh, I
is
get it.
inherently, and that's the thing with the good.
It's
Once you
mutable.
realize that an everyday object like a remote control is good for operating the TV but is bad for cutting vegetables, then you realize that the remote control is neither good nor bad inherently. It's good
Mm.
in relation for something.
Okay,
Um,
I get it.
okay. Mhm.
Okay, that makes total sense. And so, like, turning back again to the modern golden age, like dialectics would be a practice that I believe is aligned with bringing a modern golden age. In your opinion, do you have any other practices that you think we should do in order to become the individuals that then can bring a modern golden age?
Yeah, absolutely. Dialectic is a practice, but it's more about creating the framework. It's not the application, and the application of concepts is another practice which we have to do. So if I know the theory very well, but I don't go out there and practice it, then I'm nothing. I'm not doing anything that's actually good for me. If I understand what's good for me and don't act on it, that's kind of silly. So really acting in the broadest sense of the word, being out in the world, engaging with it, experimenting with what you think, because learning also happens through making mistakes, obviously. So, a budding dialectician, we have our time if, and of course, I realize that if we are underprivileged and we're very poor and we just have to work the whole time, we don't have the time and energy for dialectic. And I want to say what my vision is for dialectic later as well. Um, but we have to simply engage and be persevering and be brave about doing things in the world and learning from them. So that's the other aspect, because dialectic only kind of gives us the theoretical framework of
I
concepts. We
see.
still have to apply them. In terms of other um, activities. So, a lot of activities are in general very beneficial, but do I want to generalize right now and prescribe to everyone? I don't even prescribe dialectic to everyone. Okay, so this kind of serves as a segue to what I'm very much emphasizing about dialectic. We do dialectic as adults only because the education that we didn't get from parents who are dialecticians. Okay, so we have to remember a child that grows up with dialectician parents doesn't need to do
Yeah.
dialectic, when after they were taught to think well.
Yeah.
So, and I feel like that is a lot with the different practices that you're asking now, right? Because
Mm,
one tempting thing would be to say meditation, for example, where you like
mm,
regulate your nervous system and you're able to you to better cope with whatever reality throws at you because you're better regulated, right? Well, again, meditation should be easy to teach to children, and it is easy to teach to children. And the only reason we're prescribing it en masse to
it's
adults
because
is because we
yeah.
didn't get it as children. I think that's true for a lot of practices.
Yeah, that I had never thought about that. That makes a little sense. So mm, yeah. Okay, perfect. So I have just a bunch of other questions that are not directly related with the topic of the book. Can are but it's I don't have a perfect segue. Let's just say that. But one of them is um after following you on Twitter and having met you a bunch of different times, I think that, like me, you're a fan of conversation, of dialogue. And so my question is, why that is? Why do you think that dialogue is such an important thing?
It's a cheat code for creativity. I was just today editing the episode, which is going to be released 2 weeks from now on my podcast about creativity with two of my good friends, Nicholas and Gibran. And in there, I mentioned, and so I'm just echoing what I said in that conversation, which I heard today, and therefore echoing to you now. It's a cheat code, right? It's like so many people want to be creative in their own minds. Um, and when in fact we can just start a conversation and we are it's a surefire thing that we're going to stumble on something new that neither you nor I could have thought of by yourselves. And if this is directed at solving problems, then having a good conversation, it's almost a cheat code. Yeah, really, because it's putting both our minds together and applying them to solve a problem. It's exponentially more effective than trying to be everything in one mind, you know? And and this is true for any kind of problem. This is true for a personal problem. If the other person you're having a dialogue with is somebody who's in fact beneficial. And a lot of people would come to you with just the advice that they have, whatever, not looking at the context. But if you're talking with somebody who's thoughtful, with somebody who's aspiring to get things right, then they're going to be asking you questions about the problem that you're facing that is going to elucidate it much better than you could have done with yourself when maybe you can't even do that because you're emotionally unregulated at the moment,
Yeah,
right?
and trapped in your own narrative, and even people that
Exactly.
and sometimes like I'll say that sometimes just hearing someone, because I'm a fan of conversation, because I totally agree. I think this is a cheat code, and I think that personally it's a cheat code not only to creativity but also through a bunch of different areas, right? Like it's a way to suddenly, just like reading to me is a cheat code. It's a way to combine minds and to get into a third thing that's bigger than the conversation that was
Hmm.
happening. I talked about this with Tashin in a previous episode, and so like I think that and even sometimes, like sometimes what you need is someone who asks you a question and makes you really think about your problem. But sometimes there are conversations that you're having, someone, instead of just asking you a question, just gives you an opinion or even a piece of advice that actually can benefit you, right? So I'm a very big fan of conversation as well, and just wanted to say that I think that it goes beyond, and I think you agree too, it goes beyond only the creative part. And my second question is, like, there are two themes that I associated with you after meeting you for a while. The first one is conversation, the second one is friendship. And I was wondering, why is it friendship so important to you? I mean, I'm just assuming that it is. It might not be, but uh,
It's super important. Super important. I mean, it's about having good relationships, and it's related with conversation too. Like you say, we want to transcend ourselves. We all have this in us. We feel better when we are among like-minded, like-hearted people. So we have an interest to put ourselves in the position where we're surrounded by people who just have this effect on us, and we do that by conversation, as you say. It's our way of step by step becoming closer and closer into something that's more one in nature rather than two separate things. And friendship is another. If you and I talked about the nature of friendship, and we could agree on that, then it just makes things easier. It just cuts through a lot of suspicions, and so on, which our world is rife with, the suspicion. And I'm trying to really reverse that. I think personally in my life there was a huge change when I realized that trust and um, friendship from me to another person. Okay, friendship does not have to be mutual,
Mm-hmm.
but me being full of trust and me being a friend to other people should be the default, not something I evolve into as I meet the other person. Because if I start with suspicion, I may never be vulnerable, and we may never get as close as we could have been. So I'm not saying be reckless, right? It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this person off the street, like you can give them your wallet and like trusting people, whatever, and make it into a ridiculous kind of quip that you can put online. It's like smile at the world, and the world will smile back. Now, I don't know. Some people are assholes. Um, so nothing like that, but still, the aim and the we should go around thinking like there is a person out there. I don't want to miss a chance to help them if I can, if it's aligned with my goals, as you say. So um, and this is related to justice, which is really benefit other people at all times. Don't be content with just not harming them because it's the law or something, whatever.
Mm.
You need to be benefiting other people as much as possible.
Awesome. So, Eyal, I just have two more questions. The first one is you mentioned the education system and you're also a parent. And so besides dialectics, what are some of the things that you wish that were present in the educational system, that you now having a child realize that are very important and are not present yet?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not particularly bad, the education system. It's just a reflection of our sick society. So it's a subset of that, and so it's as
Mm,
sick as the rest of society. And society is sick. I'm not saying it's like completely unhinged, mentally ill. No, there's been certain areas where we've made progress, and I'm happy we're not in a state of anarchy and so on. But it is sick. It's not healthy, and this goes the same goes to the education system. So I think that what I see around me, if I guess I want to highlight one thing, is that parents are happy to get away from their children. They're happy to let the system take care of them, right? And I'm
yeah.
talking about 1-year-old babies, even
Mm,
6 months old babies. Okay, and it's just there are a lot of things that cause this to be the case. I think first and foremost is because our society, at least in the West, is very individualistic, and we've been played a trick on where we are kind of further and further divided and sent into our homes alone, and we don't have our tribe. We in some countries are not likely to even stay around their nuclear family past college.
mm,
So I think it takes a village, right? I mean, I didn't come up with it. It's a famous thing, but
mm,
it takes a village to raise a healthy
mm.
child.
Yeah.
And this is going to be something which I'm constantly fumbling for solutions for this, and there are no easy solutions. It's objectively hard to find a solution to the socialization problem, to
Yeah,
the going back to the community, going back to the tribe kind of thing. Super hard. Super hard for me. I'm a Western person
yeah,
who was raised in that. So I'd say that bring back familiarity, bring back people who just wish well, are not professional, but just like care for the children, and it's going to make everything easier if we have a little bit more support.
yeah. Perfect. Such a great answer. Yeah. My last question is a very personal question to me, which is: are you more comfortable answering or making questions? And the follow up would be, what do you prefer? Because you may be more comfortable in answering, but actually prefer asking. I don't know. Tell me.
That's a great question. I love it. I think that before doing dialectic, before undergoing some changes in my psyche that I worked hard on, I was just the typical person who is speaking to a person, but really in my own mind, I have a voice that's already thinking about what to say, right, to uphold some sort of image of the ego or whatever. So I'm definitely familiar with that kind of default mode. And that's very uncomfortable because it's really when you feel attacked, right? So you're basically defensive and then you go on the offensive, but it's really you go on the offensive so that they don't get to you and so on. That's very uncomfortable. But in that sense, that mode kind of you want to be talking because if you talk a lot and you can talk about the other person, that's even better, right? It's like nothing gets to you. Then with dialectic, I found out about listening and really listening. And the beauty of listening is that if you have a quiet psyche that's not does not experience inner conflict, well, you can be there for the other person, and there's nothing. This is empty, and you're just focusing on next question, which you're going to ask, and you don't just drag it out so that the conversation goes forever and it doesn't touch you, but you want to ask a good question that will lead this person to the next thought which may benefit them by giving them a great idea.
Mhm.
Um, so then I'm very comfortable with asking questions. Um, Today I'm also comfortable with giving answers. So I think with time, that's just when you become comfortable with both, that's when conversations become a lot of fun and the thing to cherish and the thing to seek out.
Yeah, such a great answer. El, thank you so much. I have a last question, which is basically, where can people find you? So if people want to subscribe to your podcast, if they want to follow you, what are the best place to do so?
Yeah, so I think we're both dedicated Twitterati. So Twitter is a good place to find me at Eyal Shay too, and yeah, reach out. My DMs are open, and I can link to a bunch of stuff. I'll send you the link to the dialectic document. I also have a website, so I'm a tour guide. If anybody's interested in that, or just a history lesson about Israel. I've done that before with people who just ask nicely, so I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do dialectic with whoever does. For as long as I'm free and I have time, I'm happy to do that for free with people and just really help the cause there. Yeah, so I don't know. Reach out. I'm just a guy with
Yeah,
interest.
we'll leave the links to your Twitter profile on the description, and also we'll leave the link to the Deep Dive podcast, which once again it's an amazing podcast, and everyone listening should subscribe because it's definitely worth it. By the way, while you're subscribing Deep Dive, you can also subscribe to Modern Golden Age podcast,
There you
and
go.
and everyone benefits basically. So that's it. El, thank you so much for doing this. It was a real pleasure. To everyone listening, please go show some love to Eyal in Twitter and subscribe to his podcast as well. And I'll see you all in the next episode. Bye, everyone.